Hi there, and welcome to Where's the Money Gone, the podcast that takes you inside the football boardroom with me and Charlie Methven. I'm a West Bromwich Albion season ticket holder, investigative journalist. Charlie is the managing director of Mount Pleasant FC in Jamaica, shareholder of Belgian club RAEC Mons. He was formerly a director of both Sunderland and Charlton Athletic, as well as being a boyhood Oxford United fan. This time, a little bit of role reversal as Charlie quizzes me about the launch of my book, Where's the Money Gone? The Battle for the Soul of English Football, which is available now via Byline Books. We had a launch a few days ago in London. Charlie was there. Charlie also attended the world's top sports industry summit, the Como Conference. So two hugely contrasting events. But all of that is, if you like, over and above and around football. Let's not forget the game itself, the beautiful game, as it's sometimes called. And Charlie, I don't know how RAEC Mons are doing. You had a reasonable start to the season, I think.
Well, I think reasonable would be putting it mildly.
Oh,
We changed the manager 5 days before the start of the season, having only taken the club over 2 or 3 weeks before that, and brought in Villa legend George Boateng as the head coach. And we were very aware when we did that it might take a little while for things to bed in. But 5 games and 5 wins later, with a positive goal difference of plus 17. And I think it's fair to say that that particular managerial change has touch wood worked out extremely well. So yeah, we sit happily currently at the top of the Belgian third division. Obviously, our aim this season is to get promoted. Always easier said than done, promotions, but it's been a jolly good start. And from Mount Pleasant's point of view, we've got a couple of big games coming up in the next week's 10 days in our CONCACAF Champions League qualifying campaign. Won our first 2 matches in that. And if we were to win our next match, or in fact, even one of our next 2 matches, then we qualify for the sort of, the knockout stages prior to the knockout stages. So we're sort of, on course on both fronts, but always aware that when you think that you've got the game beat, it tends to come and deliver you a resounding kick to the nether regions.
indeed. So Mount Pleasant, I presume the Jamaican League is in its close season now because you had playoffs a little while ago. So are these games being played in your off season, as it were, in the CONCACAF Championship?
So the Jamaica Premier League has just started as well, and we're off to a bit of a slow start in that we've had 2 or 3 games postponed because, unlike the other teams on the island of Jamaica, we have a number of players in the Reggae Boys senior team. So I think we've got 5 players in the Reggae Boys squad, and of course they're on a fantastic run right now. Again, they're probably now just 2 matches away from qualifying for the FIFA World Cup next summer. And which would be terrifically exciting for us to have, 4 or 5 players going to the World Cup from our Jamaican side. So yeah, the last few weeks have been a really happy run of results, all way round. Long may it continue, but as I said, always aware that things can go the other way. How about the Baggies, Adrian? How are they getting on?
Well, the Baggies have lost 2 in a row. We're not getting into any panic about that. We had a very good start prior to that, but we've lost 2 in a row now. And Ryan Mason, our new head coach, is still clearly settling in. We lost to Middlesbrough at the weekend, who are a team, I think, who are going to be up in the top 3 or 4 of the championship this season. They're unbeaten in 6. So we're not getting too excited about the season. We're not getting too downcast. We're trying to steer a bit of a middle way this season, but hopefully it'll turn around with a win against Leicester on Friday. But I want to talk to you, Charlie, about an experience I had this weekend. Before we talk about my book and the conference that you attended, I went to see, because Albion played on a Friday night, I went to see Port Vale, who were not a million miles away from where I live in Stoke-on-Trent, of course, playing a town called Burslem. I saw a fantastic, gripping League One match, just a real testament to the depth and the quality of English football at Vale Park. More than 9,000 people there, playing in a monsoon. Mansfield Town had a player sent off very early on in the game. So it was very cagey, cat and mouse, Port Vale trying to play around them and find the opening. First half wasn't fantastically exciting as a result, but Darren Moore, a former baggy, changed it up in the second half, made two halftime substitutions. He was bold and started trying to get behind the Mansfield defence a little bit, and that really did open up the game. Port Vale scored, took the lead. You then think, well, this is going to be 2 or 3 now to the home team. Mansfield, incredibly, with 10 men, fought back and scored an astonishing equaliser 5 minutes from time. And their fans at the far end of the 1,800 Mansfield fans there went absolutely wild, thinking they'd secured the draw against all the odds. And then, in time added on, and this is what I want to talk about, a controversial penalty. I mean, the pitch was so wet, splashing around. It was real weather for ducks in the Potteries. And the ball's knocked into the penalty area. Port Vale striker chases it down. He's being pursued by a Mansfield defender. The arm goes into the back. The Vale player goes over. To me, straight away, stonewall penalty. My mates are going, really, it's just the weather, slight touch, of course, but he goes down very easily. Anyway, the referee agrees with me, gives the penalty, from which Port Vale score the decisive goal and end up, of course, mocking their poor old Mansfield compatriots at the far end of the ground. It was just a glorious afternoon of classic English lower division football, but the promptness of the VAR and the relative lack of complaint from the Mansfield players, given the injustice they felt that had been served on them, was in marked contrast to the game we then watched in the pub afterwards in Port Vale, in Burslem, when Manchester United were playing Chelsea. And I'm sure you're aware, Charlie, Manchester United scored a goal, Bruno Fernandes, that was then subject to VAR for a possible offside. And that decision seemed to take ages. Of course, no VAR in League One, where the decision was done and dusted and the game won in that instance. But in the Premier League, where VAR, I remember, Charlie, was introduced for clear and obvious errors by the referee, it took ages for the referee to decide that United's first goal was legitimate. And yeah, the right decision was probably reached, but something of the spirit of football for me is lost in those moments. I don't necessarily object to VAR if it is really for clear and obvious errors, but if stuff is taking more than 20 seconds to review, that error to me is not clear and obvious. Where do you stand as somebody who sees football in the round, across the world now, on VAR?
I've always been an opponent. It sounds great. It sounds great. And by the way, goal line technology, that's straightforward, right?
Yeah.
That's not even VAR. That's just a little beep on the referee's watch that says the ball crossed the line. That's the long and the short of it. And that's entirely objective, measurable scientifically, no problem at all with that. That's just using technology to prevent what would be scientifically an incorrect decision. But most of these other
100%, 100% on that, Charlie, yeah.
Most of these other things are, to some degree or another, as you've just reflected on, subjective. And the irony is that the tighter the call, and therefore the less relevant it is to a clear and obvious error, the longer it's going to take, right? Because it's close. And this is where the problem of the whole thing lies. It's even the decision about what do you mean by clear and obvious error becomes a subjective thing in its own right. So once you've accepted that there is a degree of subjectivity to decision making in football, why not just leave it with the people on the field? Over the course of the season, these decisions will mostly more or less even out, or certainly over the course of 1, 2, 3 seasons. But we have to think about what, it's a sort of risk reward here, right? Which is the reward being of VAR that perhaps a few dodgy decisions might not get made. But let's look at what's lost. What's lost is huge, because effectively, my view of professional football as a spectator sport has always been that large chunks of the game are basically quite dull, right? Unless you're a video analyst looking at it from a purely professional point of view, as you said, during the first half in your game yesterday, large chunks of the game of football are quite cat and mouse. Not an awful lot happens. The ball goes here, the ball goes there, but there's not an awful lot happening in terms of goal mouth activity. So what you're waiting for in a game which is by definition a low-scoring game, unlike basketball, unlike American football and these types of things, or unlike rugby, unlike cricket, It's a low scoring game. So what you're waiting for is that moment that lifts you off your seat. And that moment that lifts you off your seat is the moment of celebration that your team or the team that you're following in that game have just scored a goal. And you can let yourself go with total abandon. Yes, come on, we've scored. Fantastic. That game on, or whatever it might be. To take that away from the game and to replace it with a 2 to 3 to 4 minute period when everyone's losing that adrenaline rush, everything's calming down, and then some bloke in a studio applies his own subjective opinion as to whether this goal was or wasn't good. For me, the risk reward isn't there. The reward of what you're stopping is not enough for what you're losing. And it's now been going 5 years or whatever it might be, and I just don't think it's worked. And sometimes when something hasn't worked, it's best to just track back and say, okay, we now know what this is good for. We understand it, right? And I would say it's two things: goal line technology, number one. Number two, checking for penalty decisions, right? Because effectively, with a penalty decision, the game has stopped anyway. It's not yet a goal, so you're not celebrating the goal yet. So you're not taking away that big adrenaline rush. Of course, there's a bit of a celebration when you've been awarded a penalty. I understand that, but sometimes these things happen in very confined quarters, in very sort of tight situations, and the game has stopped. Right. So, in other words, and it doesn't just stop for a penalty. Let's be honest, it stops for a little while as the goalkeeper dicks around, sort of, trying to taunt the forward and the forwards. There's a lot of stuff going on. So there's time in there to say, right, when there is a penalty decision, there is then a 45-second check just to make sure it's not an egregious mistake, right? And that's part of the game. You're not stopping the game for any longer than you would normally be stopping it. You're just making sure that if it's been called for handball, it did actually hit the hand. If it's been called for a trip, it actually was a trip, right? So for me, that's okay. Goal line technology is okay. All the other stuff, forget it. Going back to look for an offside 2 or 3 phases of play before and all this type of stuff, it's just destroying not the spirit of the game. It's just destroying one of the key performative, spectator-friendly elements of the game, which is the adrenaline rush of scoring. Right, spectators, but for the players as well. That ability when you score a goal just to celebrate and go, that's fantastic. That's what I play this game for. So I'm passionately opposed to the widespread use of it.
Yeah, a lot of the arguments for it focus on, I suppose, one-off occasions. The moment, for example, when Thierry Henry's handball wins France a place in a World Cup finals and denies the Republic of Ireland that chance, or when Maradona handles the ball, the hand of God, against England. So I suppose those are the most egregious examples of play that isn't spotted by the referee, of fouls that are not spotted by the referee, where VAR could make a difference. So, and of course, we often hear the argument, don't we, that VAR costs can save, that without VAR, clubs on the wrong end of decisions can get relegated, can miss out on promotion. And from a business point of view, they will lose out on tens of millions of pounds. So it's
This
that
is
balance.
just all part. It's all just part of the game. It's like saying, well, we're going to try and stop injuries because an impact injury might cost somebody a game or whatever it might be. It's just like, I'm just not clear that this is all worthwhile. Probably another area where where you could use it potentially is to review a sending off, because sending offs for me destroy matches, really. That they change the entire nature of the game. And actually, generally speaking, I mean, notwithstanding what happened with you yesterday, generally speaking, sendings offs make games more boring for some reason in one way, shape, or form. One team goes into a very defensive formation, the other team has to then try and work out how to break them down. And it's a major, major thing. And again, the game has stopped, right? So for that moment, when the referee shows the red card, the game at that moment has stopped. So to take 45 seconds, and I would limit it always to 45 seconds, because that's what enables you to decide whether it is clear and obvious, right? If it's going to take you more than 45 seconds, it's not clear and obvious. So in the top levels of football, goal line technology, yes. A review of a penalty decision, yes. Not to give a penalty decision, but potentially to reverse an incorrect penalty decision. That's the point I'm making. And potentially to reverse an incorrect sending off, right? Those three things, when the game's already stopped, I mean, you're not changing the flow of the game, and you're not stopping the adrenaline for other spectators, I'm okay with all that. But other than that, no. In the last few years, obviously, I've watched an awful lot of EFL football as of you, and I think it's interesting to me that overall the viewing numbers, both live and on TV, are increasing for the Football League at a greater extent than the Premier League. Why? Why is the Championship becoming one of the five most successful and watched leagues in Europe? I think the quality of the football is high enough, but it's not as technically good as the French league or whatever it might be, these types of things. What it has is, to a very high degree, a lot of jeopardy. Everything happens very quickly, and you are able to watch the flow of games in the EFL much more sort of successfully than you can in the Premier League, with all the stoppages and the breakages in play and that type of stuff. So I think this experiment's run long enough. I would get rid of it. What FIFA do in their own sort of global competitions, that's up to them. But it is in our control what happens within the English game, and I would say that we are losing that sense of spontaneous celebration, which is so important.
I agree with you, shockingly. Anyway, let's have a quick word about my book, shall we? The book's called Where's the Money Gone? The name of this podcast, Where's the Money Gone? The Battle for the Soul of English Football. It's available now on Byline Books. We had a little launch in London recently. And I'm going to put you in the inquisitor's chair now for a couple of questions, Charlie. What do you want to ask me about the book, or what are your observations about the book?
I've just started reading it. I finished the first chapter over the couple of days that I was in Italy. It starts, as you'd expect, and as should be the case, with your own personal early experiences in football. And in a way that leads into, of course, why you then became interested in the business of football and all this stuff, which is a very similar kind of read into to my interest in these matters as well. But I guess my first question would be, it's really one more as somebody who's, I think, too lazy to write books, is actually just to explore a little bit what the exercise of writing the book was like, where you went to, how many people you had to speak to, how long it took, how much it took out of you, just as a sort of physical exercise.
Yeah, people do say it's a hellish thing to do, and having done it, I now agree with them. And you don't quite ever know what you're letting yourself in for. I did kind of make a commitment a couple of years ago to myself. Nobody was giving me an advance or anything like that, but a commitment to myself that I would make the time to do it, even if that meant refusing some paid work, for example. But for the book, I mean, there are 400 pages, 30 chapters. And what I wanted to do was tell that story of football finance and the coming of global money into English football through the eyes of fans. So there are fan stories there with people like Joe Blott from Spirit of Shankly at Liverpool, from people at Northampton Town who saved their club, from Andy Scott, an old mate who was a Chelsea fan, to Lena Al Hathlul, whose sister was detained by the Saudi Arabian authorities for wanting to drive as a woman. And that pertained to the chapter on Newcastle United. So I'm not sure exactly how many people I interviewed, but a lot, 40 or 50. Not all of those people will feature in the book, but it is a huge undertaking, and there were about 3 drafts of it as well before I was finally almost happy with what I'd written. So it is a big thing, but I wanted to do it, and I'm glad I've done it. And of course, in the way of these things that are kind of faintly give you masochistic pleasure, I'll probably in the next few weeks start writing another one.
Well, that clearly means that basically overall you sort of enjoyed the experience, in some sort of way. But I just having pretty much you've been writing it during the time that we've done this podcast, right? That's
Yeah,
that's been the period when you've been doing it.
yeah.
So, and I know it took longer than you had originally thought or hoped, and probably more drafts and all this type of stuff. So I think it's just sort of useful to reflect on the huge amount of work that goes into these things. So the second thing I was going to ask, but almost by definition for these types of books, you end up interviewing a lot of people who have, like you, a real interest in the subject matter, right? Whereas, of course, the vast majority of fans, although it is changing somewhat, but the vast majority of fans kind of don't, right? What they're really interested in is what happens on the pitch on Saturday, and they only really get interested in the business side of things when it starts to affect their own club. What would be your reflection on the changes in the landscape in terms of fan view of football business and etc. over the last 20 to 30 years since you started, so since you were editing fanzines and all that type of stuff 30 years ago? What do you think's been the change, if
I
any?
think, yeah, well, and you're right, of course, Charlie. And yeah, as well as you say, most fans are only interested in what goes on the pitch, and in a way, that's kind of fair enough. Although, I think the lesson is really that certainly over the time of the Premier League, but even before then, that most fans have had cause to reflect on how football is run because so many clubs, from the biggest clubs in the country, whether it's Liverpool and Manchester United, have had periods of very questionable ownership. Whether it's smaller clubs who've gone out of business in their existing form, people like Bury and Macclesfield, and whether it's loads of clubs in the middle, like my club, West Brom or Birmingham City. So many of us have had cause to reflect on, well, who's running my club? How did they get there? And why didn't the authorities do something to stop them? So I think most fans have had cause to at least reflect on that. And then I guess for many fans, once the crisis at their club is over, as it usually is, but not always is over when a new owner comes, they then go back to just supporting the team, and that's fine. But I think each of those club cases makes at least a percentage of those fans think, well, hold on a minute, there's something rotten in the state of football. There's something we need to address here. So I think there has been a growing understanding by fans that actually football isn't brilliant behind the scenes, that it isn't particularly well run. And we're still left with this conundrum that English football now is richer than it has ever been, but we've never had more clubs in financial peril than we have done over the last decade or so. And it's that conundrum that I suppose I try and address in the book. Anyway, it was great to see you
Yeah,
at the. Go on, sorry, yeah.
I think so. So when I look at fans' protests against ownerships, there are two different types, but they get somewhat conflated, and I'm not sure that. I think one gets given perhaps not enough credibility, and the other one gets given far too much credibility, right? So there's one type of protest which is about a club that is in existential danger with an irresponsible owner who's behaving or has behaved or is behaving in an irrational way or in a way that endangers the club that they currently own. And we can all think of examples of that over the last few years, several of which involving people from the Far East, if we're being honest, whether it be Reading or Sheffield Wednesday, or indeed West Brom, for quite a period of time. So you can, even I can, well, not even I can see, and so can everyone in the industry can see what you might call the genuine rotten apples, the ones who bought it as a sort of plaything, screwed it up, then disappear, then don't pay the wages, then won't sell the club in an appropriate fashion, then won't all the time not communicating with fans. There's a sort of consistent theme, isn't there, to that
Yeah.
particular type of problem. And when we all see fans protesting against that, I think it's every rational person goes, well, that is fair enough, right? You're going there every week. You're putting your money in. And again, providing the majority of the money. Let's be honest, the fans provide the majority of the money. Even in clubs that lose 10 million a year, they're still got revenues of 25 million a year. And those 25 million are coming from the fans. So, I think that's all fair enough. But then you see the other type of protest, which is basically my team isn't winning and I'm really upset and I want to lash out at somebody. And that I have no respect for. That's just bullshit. That's just a little kid, like my 5-year-old daughter, totally sort of unaware of the realities of pyramid football, where things go up, things go down. You have your good periods, you have your bad periods, etc., etc. And these things often get conflated together into what might be called as bad ownership, right? So no, bad ownership is exactly what happened at Reading, West Brom, and various other clubs. And we could name 10, 15 off the top of our head who were in that boat. Things not being quite right on the pitch, that just isn't the same. And when I see things like the West Ham protest at the moment, that type of stuff, 2 years after they won a European trophy, I'm like, oh, come on, grow up, grow up.
I
You know.
And I agree with you, by the way. I mean, I think supporters are entitled to complain about the manager and the board and so on about if they're upset with what's going on the pitch. But I agree, it's of a different order. And before we move on to talk about your conference at Como, I just want to make this point that, and this is something I explore in the book, is that I think the way in which English football is run, the reliance on sugar daddies, and I compare it to the German model of 50+1, where supporters have, at the very least, the right of veto over decisions they don't like at their club because they own more than half of the football club. I think the way English football is run infantilizes supporters and says, you just turn up, you cheer the team, you provide the colour and the noise, leave it to us, the professionals. We'll look after that. You don't have to worry your pretty little head about that. So I think there is something about the way English football is run, and I think it's a bigger cultural thing. It's about our society, and it's partly about how capitalism works in our society, that we're patted on the head as supporters and told, don't worry about it, we'll look after this for you. Just hand over your money. And I think German football has a very different culture off the field than English football, and it's
Well,
one that
it's a very useful segue into the conference which I was at on Thursday and Friday of this week, the Como 50, which is 49 of global sports great leaders, and then yours truly as a totally undeserved 50th member. But I was
it wasn't
at the
50. It wasn't
conference.
50 people doing a kind of Perry Como karaoke.
As it happens, no, although that would have been very entertaining. But during the conference, I did spend quite a lot of time. I was staying in the same house as a couple of the guys who run the Bundesliga, and we were having
As you
quite,
do.
yeah, we were having a really interesting conversation about the ups and the downs of the 50+1, and obviously it makes it quite difficult to operate these clubs and also the league itself. So the league might think this is something we want to do and logically win that argument in front of the chief executives of the clubs. The chief executives of the clubs then go back to their clubs and have to try and convince their effectively their supporters' trust, really is what it is, that it's a good idea. And then very often they then come back to the next meeting and say, well, sorry, the supporters won't wear it. They don't want it. They actually, and the long and the short of it is that German football supporters basically just want things to carry on as they are. But now, why? They want things to carry on as they are because, as a real football person, basically things are very good, right? Which is they've got huge full stadiums at affordable prices with competitive football, with great culture, everything that as a real football fan, everything that you might want, German football has, possibly with the exception of Bayern being a bit too dominant. And we had a bit of a talk about the distribution model and how Bayern and Borussia get too much, really, and it should be a little bit more equally shared, etc. But leaving that to one side, the rest of it is absolutely terrific. But what do they give up by doing that? They give up really the idea that they can compete with the Premier League clubs, with the exception of Bayern. Right, it's just not really doable. That the revenues are much lower. Why? Because the ticket prices are much lower. Why? Because the league doesn't really have any great huge amounts of money to invest in itself, isn't able to attract many global stars outside of Bayern. So the ability to sell the TV rights to overseas markets is much constrained. We spoke about the deal they've done with Mark Goldbridge to screen the games through him over here, etc. So they've basically decided we're not going to dance with the devil. We are going to keep all the things that are important to us, and we are going to accept on some level, both at league level, but also at club level, that we aren't going to have sugar daddies, that we aren't going to have people telling us that we're going to lose the things that matter most to us. We're going to keep all the things that matter most for us, and we're going to wear the consequences, right? So, when you speak to people who run Bundesliga clubs and the Bundesliga itself, there are frustrations because obviously they are ambitious people who want to do interesting, innovative things, and they are held back by the innate conservatism of the German football fans who control all these clubs. So that was one quite interesting theme that we might come back to in a moment. I'll lay out a couple of other themes, Adrian, and you can work out which ones you want to talk about. So another one of which is that the TV rights packages across football are, and in fact sport more generally, in fact other sports even more than football, but let's just talk about football for a moment, are in decline. And these have been the source of the growth of the industry, but particularly the growth in player wages. And the decline is happening, first of all in the smaller markets, but then France has been now hit very, very hard. And it was really interesting speaking to the fund, the private equity fund, who are the second shareholders at PSG. I was like, well, how are things going? Well, things are going great on one hand. Our plan, the PSG plan for sort of 5 years of how to move from being a Galactico side to being a more youth-based side is well ahead of project. Everything's being executed really, really well, but at the same time, the French league's in big problems, and that causes us a different set of issues. Italian football in big problems. Again, revenues going nowhere, going backwards. Even big clubs really seeing their overall values coming down. Speaking to the chief executives of some of the very biggest Italian clubs, obviously we were in Italy, so a lot of them were there, saying, not only can we not compete with the Premier League, we've got major problems. Our stadiums are massively underdeveloped. So in terms of just being able to sort of safely stage games, in terms of match day revenues and all this type of stuff, we're miles off the pace, but we're not generating the kind of revenues that can really warrant sort of making sort of huge improvements to our stadia. Huge problem. So one of the things that was surfacing quite consistently over the 3 days was some sort of resurrected Super League, but potentially one that would be for France, Italy, and Spain. It was accepted that the English clubs are never going to come in and probably should never have been included in the first place. It was accepted that the German clubs will never go in because of their fan-owned nature. But the question was whether a French, Italian, and Spanish league at the top level could potentially really sort of punch its weight in a sort of consistent way. And then the other side of the broadcasting is the increasing global dominance of YouTube. The extent to which YouTube audiences now are so vast that it's becoming an option for monetization to start moving towards YouTube, and either using YouTube into your own channel or else having a membership model actually on YouTube itself, which is a way of broadening your audience and accepting the fact that these cozy media rights deals in 10 years' time are going to be long gone, because the younger generation doesn't like paying subscriptions for these things. And you have to start thinking beyond that. My argument to that is always, yeah, that's fine, but don't forget that for anyone over the age of 35, they do pay for these subscriptions. And, a 35, 40-year-old is going to be still paying for that for the next 40 years. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You could potentially sort of, find ways of keeping both audiences happy. Anyway, those were some of the themes that we were discussing.
Wow, so many there, and we've got about 4 minutes left. So we're not going to explore all of them, are we? Out of all that, do you think then that a European Super League, perhaps without English clubs, is going to happen? Do you think it will happen?
Yes. Yeah, I do. I do, because I think the struggles of those big clubs in those countries to maintain pace with the Premier League, not even that, even the mid-table Premier League clubs, is becoming. Do you remember last year we looked at the football rich list of the 20 richest clubs in the world, and it turned out like 11 or 12 of them were from the Premier League. You had clubs like West Ham in 15th place and that type of stuff. It's so. I think it will. I think it probably should always have been those three countries, and maybe they could have brought in Benfica and Sporting Lisbon as well as being sort of vaguely contiguous. You could even look at Anderlecht and Standard Liège and Bruges maybe as well. But basically, the continental landmass where people can travel relatively straightforwardly by train or by car to different destinations, I think would be a natural place for them to go. Obviously, they have historic domestic leagues which would suffer as a result. So I'm not sort of minimizing the impacts. I'm just saying that I think, given the levels of distress that I'm feeling in those leagues and in those clubs, and we've discussed Barcelona before, I'm just thinking that this might be something which down the track becomes a reality. I have to say, I didn't hear that at all from, as I mentioned, PSG. That wasn't coming from PSG at all. PSG are hugely successful. It's a different thing. But I was hearing it a bit from other reaches of that continental landmass.
Fascinating stuff, Charlie. Thank you. One of the Como 50. Who knew? Great to hear from Charlie, as always. And thanks to him for attending the launch of my book. If you do want to buy it, the book is called Where's the Money Gone? The Battle for the Soul of English Football. You don't have to read it, just buy it. It'll make a great Christmas present. You can order that from Byline Books. And just a couple of appearances relating to that. I'm going to be talking about the book at the Bewdley Festival in Worcestershire on October the 16th and doing events as well in Newcastle and Liverpool on November the 5th and the 6th. So I'll have more details of that on our Substack. If you do head over to Where's the Money Gone? Substack, you'll get additional content. My thanks to Jed Thomas for his production assistance on this episode. And thanks also to Mark Machado for his work on our socials. Thank you for listening. We'll be back again next week. Thanks, Charlie. Take care now. And
Thanks, Adrian.
we'll see you soon. Cheers now. Bye-bye.